think of somebody today or tomorrow that you can encourage, or you can say something nice for, or even do something nice for without them even knowing it.
Absolutely.
That makes you feel good too.
Welcome to the Meyer Clinics podcast. Join our licensed clinical professionals from various backgrounds as they discuss fascinating mental health topics with a wide range of guests. Meyer Clinics is a Christian counseling organization with multiple clinics nationwide dedicated to treating the whole person, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Welcome to our listening family. We thank you for joining us. Hi, everyone. Kristen Walker here, and I'm here with Jonathan Mcgee. We are finishing up our podcast that we did on what our kids face in this era. Jonathan, if you don't mind just giving everyone a little refresher on who you are.
Yes. Well, my name is Jonathan Mcgee, and I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of Texas. And I actually serve as the program manager of an adolescent mental health program here at Meyer Clinics. It's the Breakaway program in Richardson. And it's a program for adolescents who are struggling and need more than once a week therapy. It's very intense. It's every day for several hours. So that's currently my role at Meyer Clinics.
And, it's interesting. We need that so much now. Even since we did our last show, which was about 3 weeks ago on this topic, I have been inundated even more than usual about how many kids are really struggling, and that people are, what it's like. You go through something like a pandemic. Well, none of us have been through that, but you go through some kind of trauma, and then you have a little bit of you get into the business of life, and you forget, oh yeah, this was a trauma. This huge thing happened. Life is completely different now, and I'm really struggling, and I'm not sure, where that's coming from. So, I find it fascinating that we do this show, and I got so many responses from people saying, yeah, you want to forget that we're in this struggle, and yet this is for real.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I would describe it as unprecedented historically. I mean, mental health crisis for sure, adolescents, but we're still seeing the effects of the pandemic,
everybody,
the response to the pandemic, and we're going to be teasing that out for a while, I think.
Oh yeah, absolutely, for quite some time. And there will be so many studies, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, about the long-term effects of what's gone on. And because it wasn't just the pandemic, it was, the change of school. It was everything to do with the stress of our parents, the stress of having our social disconnection taken away, and then having everything be online, including how we learn. I mean, just so many things that have upended everyone's experience of life.
Yeah, and that's the common answer, because a lot of times I ask, well, when did you first feel depressed, or when did you first feel anxious or have a panic attack? We ask those kind of questions when we meet clients. And one of the most common answers is, well, when I stopped going to school, when school went online, when I didn't see my friends every day. That's probably the most common answer I get.
Yeah. And that's the way that brains are formulated in kids too, the way that that routine, that connection with others is so necessary as part of development. What are we going to see 30 years from now with the kids that are kids today? How is that going to impact their life as they become our age?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we're in the middle of it right now. And we're out here on the front lines trying to do the best we can to help the adolescents walk through this stuff. It's kind of, when you sit and kind of think of the whole scope of things, it can feel overwhelming at times.
Absolutely. I just had my own little existential crisis this morning, thinking, and then I read an article that a friend of mine wrote. She was one of the first people to come out against Larry Nassar, the coach who was abusing gymnasts. And, she's going through the same thing. I did this challenging thing. I've done so much to help others. Now what? And that's an adult perspective. What do kids that are still figuring out how to have perspective, what the heck are they doing?
Oh, yeah. And when they get a lot of their perspective from their peers, and then, oh, now my peers are gone, or I'm only interacting through social media, which we've discussed how, that's not real life and that's detrimental. Yeah, I mean, something like this never happened before. And
Exactly.
kids are struggling, and that's an understatement.
So let's talk about the things that we didn't get to on the last show. One of them was incidents of self-harm. What are you seeing? And I mean, of course, there's cutting and there's substance abuse. What stood out to me was you talking about how the incidence of drinking and using substances went down for kids and up for parents. And I thought of a million different reasons why that would be so. Obviously, they're home, so they're under watch more.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But what else can you add to that?
Yeah, well, self-harm was seeing that before the pandemic, but it just seems like it has escalated like a lot of issues. But, the people I work with are people that have mental health struggles or disorders. And so it's incredibly common. But it seems to be an issue that afflicts adolescent females much more than males. And so I just kind of saw it every single day and just thought, this is just it's one of the things we ask about when we try to get a holistic picture of how a person is doing. And I just got used to the answer being yes, especially being a female. But I went and looked at some studies that was in the Journal of Pediatrics. And I mean, the rate of self-harm for ninth grade girls is like 19% in some of the studies they've done. And then they compare that with ninth grade boys at 5%. So it's a much higher rate with females, and then it gets higher as they get older, all the way up to when they're in high school, rates of 14 to 20%, and then for college, it actually went up to about 40%.
Wow, and
which again being mostly female.
And that's this time after post-pandemic, correct? That those numbers are that way.
Yes. Yep. This was the most recent studies that I had seen reported.
Wow. And you're seeing that,
again, that was
yourself.
Yeah. So it's very common. And I see two types of self-harm, and there's the kind that the adolescents are hiding. And it seems to be rooted more in shame. Toxic shame, like there's something wrong with me fundamentally. It's those kind of beliefs that can feed into depression and anxiety. But when kids are using it to cope with, I would say, like shame or depression, then it's something that's kind of hidden. They try to hide that with wear on their body, that they harm themselves, or maybe the method that they're using, so that parents aren't aware. And so most of the time when parents find out, it's it's not because the kids wanted them to. They find out. And then, it causes a huge dysfunction in the family, and the parents are very concerned, obviously. But the kids never wanted anyone to find out, and so they're hiding that. And so those kids usually won't tell me up front, but, sometime in the program, then it does come out, and they, usually because other kids are talking about it, and they'll say, I do that too. And they'll talk about it. And so that one, there's a lot of speculation about why it works as a coping mechanism, or why people are using it as a coping mechanism, especially the adolescents. But, and I'm no expert on this. Dr. Meyer would know a lot more. Medical people would know a lot more, but there's the endogenous, opioid system that when we get hurt, our brain in our body produces these chemicals that help us, right? Like pain relieving function of the body, right? The body's so amazing, and it has ways to help us out, right? So there, the theory is that kids are accessing that system through harming themselves, right? So there is a potentially addictive quality to it. So that's the first type that we see. And then the other type that I see is very much for the parents to see. So the adolescents are doing it in a place where the parents will see it, or they're doing it in front of the parents, or they're doing it and then they show the parents. And so that seems to be a different case. And that, when I talk to adolescents that's the case for, it seems like they feel invalidated, or that their parents aren't taking their struggle seriously. And so this is more of a cry of help and like, hey, pay attention to me, more than like an addictive behavior that's been ongoing. It could be more of like a one-time thing of like, hey, take me seriously. So those are the two types of self-harming behavior that I'm seeing that are pretty common. And it seems like males are more of the second type, where they're real upset and they're wanting people to take them seriously. That's usually the adolescent males are talking about it in that way. And then the females are both, but what I'm seeing tend to be more of the first type, of more of an addictive type of a behavior or coping mechanism,
Well, it
for
is.
probably shame and depression.
Hi, this is Dr. Paul Meyer of the Meyer Clinics. Our Christian counselors across the country have a goal of helping all those who come to us to become what God has called them to be. If you're in a situation where you're not at peace within yourself, or you just feel like there's joy that's missing in your life, we can come alongside to help you obtain peace and joy.
This message is sponsored by the Meyer Clinic Foundation, a nonprofit Christian counseling ministry. The number is 1-888-7-CLINIC, 1-888-7-CLINIC.
Yes, your body is, when you cut yourself, as an example, you're getting a flood of brain chemicals, in some very similar to what you get from, being on social media.
Oh yeah. And, we talk about this all the time in the mental health field, but, they created that stuff to tap into that. I mean, that's how they make it addicting. They tapping into that reward pathway in the brain and dopamine and all that stuff. I mean, that's by design. And so, yeah, I mean, these neurochemicals are super powerful, and they can, they could dictate behavior at times. And so I find, so a lot of parents are, and they are rightfully concerned when someone's harming themselves, but it's very distressing for parents, and they try to understand, and they can't understand why someone would do that. But, with the neurochemical piece and the coping mechanism piece, or the taking me seriously piece, if you talk to the adolescent for long enough, then the reasoning behind that becomes clear, which gives us the path forward to work through with therapy, with the family.
Are there things that you see when you're treating someone that that they're self-harming, even if you're not seeing, the actual self-harm itself showing up on their body, but you just know, I bet they're self-harming? Are there behaviors or ways that they're speaking that those things come up, and you get that feeling that you just know something's going on, and you hope that, you'll be able to get them to talk about it?
So usually if they're hiding it, they're still in that kind of second category where they don't want necessarily people to know about it. Then I can tell, like in group, how they interact with other people as they're talking about it, like their facial expressions, their body language, like the comments they make, or maybe the questions they ask. Or they'll, I have a friend, right? I have the friend. They'll ask a question about their friend, but it's obviously, they're talking about themselves. Those are kind of the maybe red flags or tells that I would pick up on. Yeah. Mm. But usually they're pretty honest about it. And I mean, it's something I ask directly. I ask everyone that question. So whether they tell me up front or they end up telling me later, I mean, they usually do. Of course, I guess I wouldn't know if they didn't.
Right.
But I find that working with adolescents, after they trust you, which actually it doesn't take that long for them to build trust, then they're really honest, brutally honest at times, which can be funny.
I remember, I do remember my own things with that. So many things being hidden, and then you're just looking for anyone that will listen to what you have to say, not judge it, just, listen to you. And so when someone does, it's really easy to bond. As an adolescent, it's really, you can open up that you're not crushed by a lot of life of being ignored yet. So, yeah.
Oh,
Well,
absolutely.
let's delve into the social media piece, because this definitely, ties into this. But yeah, I mean, there was no way to connect with anyone other than this. So I have heard thank goodness for social media that they had an outlet. And I've heard, oh my gosh, absolutely horrible, and variations in between. And just a year before the pandemic, I was speaking at a conference that was to do with children's mental health. And my topic was about social media and its impact and how do we deal with it. So it's really interesting. Every single thing that I said and our panel said in that conference, our session, absolutely meant nothing once the pandemic hit.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. I mean, their whole physical interaction world was taken away. And then all they're left with is social media, which I think they were preferring anyway. You know, from what I'm hearing, that they preferred to interact online as opposed to, you know, when I was growing up, we had social media in very limited ways, but, you know, we would still go to malls or parks or movies or things like that. And I was talking to an adolescent this week and I said, well, you know, you and your friends could go to the mall. And he was like, well, what's a mall? Like, I'd never been to a mall, you know? They knew what movies were, but, you know, so
yeah, you stream them. You don't go to a movie theater. You stream movies. I know, it's so,
you watch Netflix. Yeah,
it's so profoundly different. And some of the things, I had two of the students that were in at the conference that were in my session, one of my sessions, reach out to me during the pandemic and said, you know, some of the things that you said, I had done a whole thing about, you know, when I go out and I'm with my horse and I'm with that animal, and you are required to be present with an animal that large, and especially a horse. Like a dog, you can pat on the head and the dog is like pleading with you, look at me, interact with me, but it'll eventually just, you know, get used to being treated that way. A horse will not allow that. And I was explaining how the woman 20 years younger than me that was working with my horses would be in the middle of a ring and she'd be on her phone while she's exercising a horse because she was so into what was going on with her phone. And I had said, my God, put the phone away. Don't even bring it with you. And they all looked at me and rolled their eyes at the time I gave the speech. And then after and during the pandemic, it was, no, you were right. Like, you were right. Like, the answer was just put it away. The answer was just be present with my friends. But we couldn't hear you then. And now we get it.
Well, that's a somewhat human nature piece where people have to learn the hard way sometimes, you know. They have to have some negative consequences, and then they realize, oh, wait, you know, she was right about that.
Yeah, I mean,
what they see the consequences.
Right, exactly. So when there's nothing other than that social media to connect, how are you dealing with that as a counselor? You know, there's this thing, it's not going away. It was the only way to connect, as unhealthy as it was in so many ways. How are you working with kids to keep healthy mentally and so on with this piece that's there?
Well, I think a lot of times a therapist's job is to educate. So, you know, working with families, a lot of times parents want us to tell them what to do as far as a parenting decision, which, you know, is outside my scope of practice, is to tell you how to parent your children, right? But I can talk about the studies and I can give the statistics and make recommendations or for them to make the decision, right? So I can't tell you like, well, don't let your kids use social media, but the studies show that if they use it for 2 or 3 hours a day, then the effects on their mental health is super detrimental. Especially, again, I feel so bad for adolescent females. They're just having a really hard time with all these statistics and studies, or they're more honest, you know, one or the other when they take the studies. But it was especially the ones I'm looking at are looking at middle school girls, you know, 10 to 13 years old, using social media 2 to 3 hours per day. So a lot of times my recommendation is really limit that. You know, they have apps for that. They have, you know, say like screen time type things. So, you know, just pay attention to how much they're actually using it. Because when they get into those 2 or 3 hours a day on social media, that's kind of like the danger zone that we've seen. and let them know that we've seen this huge increase in death by suicide starting in 2000. And then the studies I'm seeing are usually between 2000 and 2016, which again is correlational. But when you have the social media being created and the youth going up, and then you have the suicide rates going up, people pay attention to that.
Right.
Absolutely. So I'm going to be letting parents know all that stuff. I let the teenagers know that as well. And a lot of them are coming from hospitals, unfortunately from a self-harm or suicide attempt. And then they're coming to our program as a follow-up for care. But one of the things they do in the hospital is they take away the phone. And so these kids are getting this kind of like accidental exposure to 7 to 10 days of no social media at all. And
Right.
actually they love it when they come out. And they're
Yes.
talking to me about, well, how was that not having your phone for 10 days? Well, that was the best thing that's happened to me in a year.
Yeah.
So they learn it through these trials and tribulations that they're going through. But they get it once they have that separation. And so parents, how they're going to react and how they're going to let their kids use the social media, that's going to be up to them. But yeah, just a lot of education about how it works. Of course, I talk to them about what we've talked about, how it's designed. It's designed to be addicting and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the studies I'm looking at, it doesn't seem like they find that same correlation with adolescent boys. So it seems to be afflicting the adolescent girls. I wasn't seeing so much of a link in the studies for boys. So it seems like a less threatening, I guess, situation for them. And for whatever reason that is, but part of it is they have observed that teenage women or teenage girls will ruminate more than teenage boys, right?
Right.
Which of course feeds into depression. It feeds into rumination, into anxiety. And so there seems to be that characteristic
Self-image.
that seems to be a gender difference. Yeah.
Yeah. The self-image piece
Absolutely.
is huge. I mean, so huge. And it's interesting when I've given talks about this too, I've said, you can't, I'm in a room with parents, and then the next thing I would be in a room with adolescents. And I'd say to the adolescents, I just told all your parents that they can't tell you to stay off their phone if they're sitting there on their phone all day too.
Right.
And
Yes.
I try to say, does anybody watch soap operas? If any, to the parents, kids don't really get into those at all. But the new soap operas that they've replaced what we know as soap operas, or maybe what I know as soap operas. But you can leave that story for years and come back, and it's the same stuff going on. There is nothing new. So you really aren't. Jojo and Jim are still doing this and like nothing really has changed. So you can dip out and you're going to be okay. You really haven't missed anything.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And those, yeah, I mean, I got off of all social media completely during the pandemic, just no more. I can't take it anymore. And I have not gone back since. And every so often I'll go in just to see, okay, what is going on? And I'm like, yep, it's the same stuff. Nothing has changed. And what I wonder with kids and what you see with this, there's so much about creating this life that isn't real. And when you're locked at home, doing everything at home, there's not that much to invent because you're not out doing this, that, or the other. So a lot of people that I talked to said that their kids felt really hampered. Like, I don't know what to invent because I can't leave. So have you heard anything, along those lines?
Yes, absolutely. That, I mean, it kind of ties into something we're going to talk about, which with boredom. But teenagers being stuck at home, they have to find things to do. And a lot of times those things aren't productive. We're looking at risky behavior, deviant behavior, drug experimentation. And those are effects of boredom, or being isolated from friends, having nothing to do all day long. yeah, I'm hearing that from tons of teenagers. I just wish I could go out. I wish my parents would let me hang out with my friends. Which, that's one of the things that parents can use for discipline, right? You ground a kid and say, well, you can't see your friends. It's devastating to kids. That's why they use it as discipline, because it's the negative consequence that parents can utilize, right? And it's just, but when it becomes months and months and months, whether that's because of the pandemic or because they're grounded for months and months and months, then that's when I hear a lot of teenagers talking about, well, that's when I, tried marijuana for the first time, or that's when I did X, Y, or Z that my parents found out about, and now we're in conflict about.
Right.
So yeah, it's not easy being a parent, and especially during the pandemic and with adolescents. I mean, like, gosh, I pray for everybody that's raising adolescents right now. Like,
yeah, absolutely
tough. But the social media, and like you said, the other thing I tell parents is, like, the number one way to make your kids angry is to tell them they can't do something that you're doing.
Right.
Right. Like, don't smoke cigarettes while dad's smoking 2 packs a day. Right. That was the classic example I'd always hear from people. So, or, don't use social media. And then mom's on Facebook all day long. Like, that's one way to make sure that your kids will be very upset with you. For sure.
Right. So true. So true.
Is the way that they're using social media has surprised me. Because social media has developed since I was in college or a teenager, right? But a lot of these adolescents are describing, you meet someone, how they're making friends work or dating relationships work is you meet a new person, you get their Instagram and you follow each other on Instagram. And then I'm often hearing that the next step is actually then you send the nude pictures of yourself to the person, especially if you're trying to date the person. And then once that happens, then you start hanging out and building the relationship. But it's almost like that's the first thing that happens. Wow. This is a huge problem for so many reasons. But I'm hearing it from almost all the adolescents that I'm working with. Is very, very disturbing way of using social media. So it's not just a tool that was created to be addicting, but it's just the way that it's been adapted and used by teenagers now. And that seems to be the way they're dating.
Messaging. Yeah, that direct messaging piece is what you're talking about, I'm assuming, where you see what's publicly posted, but then you can send a DM to someone and that will be, exposing yourself physically in some way or another.
Right. Which opens the door to more body shaming or bullying or blackmail. I mean, it's just, and then you're talking about adolescents, child pornography. I mean, there's just infinite problems with using social media that way for adolescents. But it seems to be a very common trend. And even, I'm hearing people are telling me I'm on Tinder, and I had to look into this because I'm like, well, you're not 18. But the Huffington Post, had a article I found that they're estimating 7% of Tinder users are minors that have somehow found a way around the age verification system. So that's dangerous, the way that they're using these apps intended for adults, and they're finding access to that and they're using it. And then the response for parents, because that's something that it goes beyond confidentiality as a therapist. I mean, that's dangerous. That's something that I have to tell parents about. That's not something that I would keep a secret in the therapeutic relationship. And a lot of times parents just kind of throw up their arms and they're like, well, what are we supposed to do about it? That's what they're all doing. That's what they're all doing that. And again, I can't tell them what to do. I can't tell them how to be parents. But a lot of times they're aware of it. So all of that use of social media, that side of it, the kind of less sexual use of social media has been quite shocking to me, but it's been a consistent thing that I'm talking with families about for sure.
And it's so easy when you're that removed in that way. It's different. It's, happens still, of course, but when you have that layer of sort of what you think is anonymity, to go into a sexual place, which this is the time that, they're wanting to experiment anyway, but it's so easy. It's so easy to fall into that and then share things that you go, oh my gosh, and their brains are not developed in a way to tell them to stop. It's just, that is frightening because that will impact them years from now. but that what I see is that the numbness to it, because it's done through social media. And then if they're setting up some sort of meeting in person with someone and they don't know who that is, they're already so numb to things because of everything that's flashed before them visually. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
There was a case, I think it was in Texas, I'm not sure, but just recently, where a father took his daughter to a stadium to see a basketball game, I think, and they found her on security cameras walking off with some guy. And she was kidnapped and they tried to traffic her for 10 days. And what they're trying to figure out now is, why did she just walk off with some guy when she was going to the bathroom? How did this happen? Everything was set up through social media.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I remember reading about that, but I didn't know the piece where she like voluntarily walked off. I mean, gosh, that's just terrifying.
Yeah.
But not surprising that that's what predators are using. That's how they're getting access to adolescents. Unfortunately, my gosh.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you have a discussion with a young, adolescent girl or boy about the pornography piece? Because it's, of course, tied to social media, but then it's also just really tied to phone usage and where they go online.
Yeah, pornography is another one that comes up, very commonly, and parents want to talk about it, or they don't know how to approach the topic. I think the research I was looking up again is the first exposure now is 11 years old, is seeing pornographic material. And that's just gone down because of the internet. I mean, and access, right? Ease of access. It's just available by accident, in fact. Because 68% of adolescents in the same study were saying that they unintentionally encountered pornography.
Right.
So, clicking a link or typing a website and then bam, there it is. You're not even looking for it. And so it affects kids as they're trying to develop their identity, because if they're looking at pornography to try to develop their sexual identity, they're looking at something that's very much a fantasy. It's not a representative of real life for most people, I would say.
Right.
A lot of it can be harmful, violent, and kids, they're not talking to their parents about it. A lot of times I'm finding. And so they're just talking to their friends about it, and they might think, well, this is real life, or this is what people are doing in their bedrooms. And actually what surprised me is the number one thing kids are telling me is, I wish my parents would have talked to me about sex.
Right.
I wish they would have talked to me about it when I was young, before I saw all this stuff. That's pretty much 100%. They're all telling me that. I've had kids just crying because they're like, man, my sex education was watching hardcore pornography on the internet.
Yeah.
If only my parents would have talked to me about it first. And a lot of times parents, they think that's awkward, or they came from families where you don't discuss such things. And there's a way to do that that's healthy, and we can encourage parents in the way that they talk to kids about that stuff. But, I'm just telling parents that if you're not in the conversation with your kids, they're already having it. So they're having it with their friends, or they're having it with people online or at school or wherever. The conversation is happening. You're just choosing whether or not to be a part of the conversation. And kids actually want their parents to be a part of the conversation. That's the thing I'm hearing most from kids, is just kind of like regret at the exposure to pornography and wishing that their parents had talked to them. But I think a lot of female celebrities recently have come out and started kind of denouncing the whole pornography industry. I pulled up an article about Billie Eilish really speaking out about pornography and the effects that it had on her, and discouraging teenage girls, adolescent females, from accessing pornography or thinking that that's realistic, or and how it distorted her view of sex and herself and her body, and just all the negative things that go into that. And so I was really happy to see that.
Her femininity.
Talking about that.
Yeah, the ties to that, and being more androgynous in your dress and how you refer to yourself and so on, as a reaction away from what you see as, that's what I'm supposed to do as a female or as a male. Oh my gosh, I don't want anything to do with that. I read an article with Billie Eilish saying, this is why I don't dress provocatively. I won't. This is why I choose to be more androgynous and how I present myself. And there are some positives to that. And then there's also this total, shutting yourself down from what you are as a female or as a male. And then there's a lot of confusion there. I want to make sure that we get to the two things on your list. One of them, the rise in LGBT identification versus behavior, and also the increase in autism spectrum disorder. So let's talk about the rise in the LGBT identification.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to be clear, I'm working with, adolescents where their sexual orientation or their gender identity is causing them problems,
Right.
causing them distress, causing them anxiety, causing depression. And so that's the population I work with. And there's a large population where that's not the case for them. But they're not the kind of people that I would be working with. And so I'm also working with families where it's causing dysfunction in the family. So that would be the adolescent identifying as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual, whatever it is that they are identifying as a teenager that's causing problems in the family. So first of all, those are the types of people that I'm working with. But people, we're noticing this huge rise in the identification of, especially again in women, adolescent females, as mostly identifying as bisexual, huge amounts, or lesbian, but mostly bisexual. And so it's becoming just incredibly common. In fact, I'm not sure how many recently have been in the program that would identify as heterosexual, that were adolescent females. So we're seeing it, and I think what we're seeing happening right in front of us is a change in language and also the boundaries of sexuality socially, but mostly the language. And so there's a lot of problems happening between parents and adolescents with what do these words mean. So I think for me, historically, or from a psychological perspective, you talk about sex as a behavior. So I think in the past, if someone identifies as, like, say, a gay man, that's because they're engaging in the behavior of having sex with other men. But that's not so much the case when I'm talking to adolescents. They're identifying as bisexual, gay, lesbian, but there's no behavior following that. It's an identity piece. And so there's this change in the way that they're using the words. And so I wanted, of course, I love statistics. So I'm looking up all this stuff to see, what are the researchers saying? And so there's what's called the General Social Survey, which is this huge social survey started in the 70s. And they found that in 2008, about 5% of Americans under the age of 30 were identifying as LGBT. And also that the behavior was the same. So 5% of people identified and 5% of people engaged in the behavior. And that was in 2008. But by 2021, the proportion identifying as LGBT had increased 11 points all the way up to 16% as identification, but the behavior only rose 3 points to 8%. So we see about 50% of the people identifying as non-heterosexual as engaging in the behaviors, the sexual behaviors that go along with what those words I think historically have meant. So the identities become twice as prevalent as the behavior. And also the study found that 20% of these people that identify as non-heterosexual are not sexually active at all. And so that's what I'm finding when I'm talking to adolescents is, I ask them, is your gender identity causing you any issues, or is your sexual orientation causing you any issues? And they say yes or no. But I also ask, as part of the assessment, which is very thorough, are you sexually active? And the answer to that's almost always no. Which again, we're talking about minors. So, I would like that answer to be no. The state of Texas, minors can't consent to sex. It's not legal for them to be sexually active. So I do encourage people to wait on that. That's not something you need to jump into and experiment with as an adolescent. It's, illegal for you. But so, that's usually the answer I get. But the problem is it's causing conflict, right? So that's, in psychology, you could experience all sorts of things, but if it's not causing you distress, then it's not a disorder.
Right.
So there has to be that distress piece. And so a lot of times working with parents is to just educate them again about the statistics, educate them about the language. And a lot of times I like to use the adolescents to educate. I mean, even myself, I mean, they're explaining things to me all the time. These different sexual identities and all sorts of things. And they want to talk about it, and they want to talk about it with their parents. And a lot of times parents don't want to talk about that topic, or they want to hire us to do it. Like,
right.
Hey, here's my teenager. This is what they told me.
Them.
So yeah, we'll see you in 4 weeks. But we want that to be an ongoing conversation with the family.
Right.
In how they deal with that. And so, and again, if a teenager is identifying as non-heterosexual and they come out to their parents, and their parents, how they respond can be devastating.
Yeah.
To the teenager, or their friends, how their friends respond on social media, all of these things. And so that's what I'm seeing is a huge increase, especially among the adolescent females, of identifying as non-heterosexual. But again, like these surveys are showing, it's not so much the behavior. So the words are changing, and it's more about identity than something that they're actively engaging in. And so there's a lot. So it's it's a lot of coaching with families about how to talk about that.
Right. And coaching in terms of, okay, you haven't been part of the conversation possibly as a parent. Now there is no passing this off. You have to be part of the conversation before something becomes behavior that might be detrimental.
Oh, absolutely. And the teenagers want their parents to talk about it.
Right.
And a lot of teenagers don't want to admit, but I mean, even though they're in that phase where they're pulling away from their parents, but your relationship with your biological parents is just such a powerful, profoundly powerful relationship, whether you know your biological parents or not. And so reactions, a lot of times we're doing cleanup for families. An adolescent comes out and there's some kind of reaction that causes huge conflict and dysfunction in the family. And then now we're playing cleanup and doing family therapy, individual therapy, coaching. How do you talk, for an adolescent, how do you talk respectfully to your parent? How do you share your emotions and your thoughts and your experiences? Because you're experiencing these things. These thoughts you're having, emotions that are tied to that. How do you explain those things to your parents? And then parents, how do you show your kids that you love them unconditionally, but then also talk to them about their sexual identity or behaviors or any host of issues that you might be talking to them about? How do you do that in a way that's not detrimental or doesn't, crush them, so to speak?
Right. Well, let's talk about the last one on the list, the rise in diagnosing, I guess, or autism spectrum disorder. Give us an idea of what you're seeing there.
Right. So we're, seeing a huge increase, and there's a lot of debate publicly about why that is, whether it's actually increasing or if we're diagnosing it better. And I can't weigh in on that.
Right.
But they are, we're seeing a lot, 1 in 27 boys with autism. And then I'm seeing it, I don't know, it seems like 50% of the teenagers I'm working with, maybe about 50% of the boys probably have an autism spectrum diagnosis, which from a clinical or a treatment therapy perspective just makes things more complicated. Because you're not just dealing with depression, you're not just dealing with anxiety, you're also dealing with another set of symptoms. And then, of course, recently it's become a spectrum. It used to have separate diagnosis. And so you're seeing and people with autism are so different. I mean, you can't even, again, the spectrum is appropriate because you can't just say, oh, you have autism, then that means X, Y, or Z.
Right.
Because everyone is so different that has autism. So one teenager may have a lack of empathy, but even then, I don't know if that's the autism, because the teenager sitting next to him with the same diagnosis has a ton of empathy to the point where it's actually causing them problems because they're so empathetic with people. So it's, I guess, what it's doing for us is just making things more complicated. And so a lot of that comes down to like social coaching. I had one adolescent come in one day and he asked me, like, where do you get your haircut? Walmart? I was like, oh, well, what do you mean by that? He just was going off about my hair. It just looked terrible. And it's like, well, hey, is that how you talk to people? Do you know that some people might get upset about that? Like, you just say everything that you're thinking, right? But that was a thing with him, and it could not necessarily be with everybody on the autism spectrum, right? But a lot of times it's like a filter type thing. I've had a lot of adolescent boys who they're just really angry, and the way that anger comes out is they don't have much of a filter, so they just say things like, well, I just want to hurt you, or I just want to hurt myself. And it's really like a manifestation of anger. I don't think that they're dangerous in any way. They just have to kind of let it out, and it seems to be worse. It seems to be causing more problems for these teenage boys that are on the autism spectrum. Seems to be less of a filter thing. So
how about in terms of girls? I know that there's so much about autism spectrum disorder being something tied to more so in males than females, but are you seeing a rise or have you, since the pandemic, seen a rise in diagnosis of females on the spectrum?
I can't say that I have noticed that. Okay. Again, that's my anecdotal experience with my limited number of people that I'm working with here in Texas, right? But I would say I've noticed it with men, maybe not so much with female. I think with females, it's more of like a suspicion of like maybe, because it's harder to diagnose. And a lot of times with females, they get diagnosed much later, like in high school or as adults, they would receive that diagnosis. So I think with the adolescents we're working with, sometimes it's like a question mark. That's not necessarily obvious or causing them problems, but you get medical people involved for a diagnosis like that, psychological testing, things like that to nail down that diagnosis. So I guess that's a really long answer for I'm not seeing it so much as an increase with maybe girls as I am with boys.
Well, it helps so much. I mean, I'm glad that we did these shows, and we could do 10 episodes on this, and we're condensing it to 2, but it's helped me and the people that have responded to the shows that they've listened to. It's helped them. I told everyone, don't expect these shows to have an answer for you of how to fix, quote unquote, all of this. That we're still in the soup. We're not there yet. So there's, like I said, long-term studies, but it helps to know what's going on. And that's what I wanted to say. Thank you for doing this, and for Dr. Paul Meyer to come on too for our first show, because knowing these things has certainly helped me with my perspective on what's going on, and the people that have reached out. Knowing the statistics, knowing what you're seeing, in front of your face every day as you do your work, that helps more so than, I've certainly had people that come on and say, well, I have all the answers to this, to what to do with your kids, after the pandemic. And I'm like, well, that's quite egotistical to say that, because you don't have all the answers. No one does. Right now, we're in the processing information that we are receiving experientially. That's where we're at. So let's just be honest about that's where we're at. There is no, I got the answer for you. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I appreciate the opportunity. Absolute. Just 100%. It was so much fun to talk to you these 2 times. And honestly, we get into this profession to help people. So, and with parents, I think knowledge right now is going to be a huge tool for them, just knowing, again, the things we talked about. But yeah, I kind of feel like at times we're just kind of like holding down the fort, doing the best we can, pulling from the skills that we have. But yeah, I would be skeptical too if someone's telling me they know the answers to these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on. I hope we have you on again, and, keep doing what you're doing. And thank you for choosing to do what it is you do.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Listeners, thank you for tuning in, and we will catch you on the next episode. We hope you enjoyed this podcast. Tune in next time for another engaging discussion on relevant mental health topics. If you have any questions about Meyer Clinics, please visit our website at meyerclinics.com. That's MEIER clinics.com, or call us at 888-7-CLINIC. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or any of your favorite podcast apps. And please note that we are a member of and produced by Mental Health News Radio Network, mhnrnetwork.com.